Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 14 years, and throughout that extensive career, he had developed an almost sixth sense for detecting tension between family members who appeared on his stage. He could recognize the subtle signs of unresolved conflict in the way people positioned themselves relative to each other, the carefully controlled expressions that suggested suppressed anger or resentment, and the forced enthusiasm that indicated families performing unity rather than genuinely experiencing it. On this humid July afternoon in 2025, as he prepared to welcome two families onto the stage for what the production schedule indicated would be standard programming, Steve noticed immediately that one family carried an energy that suggested something volatile was simmering beneath the surface of their polite smiles and coordinated outfits. What would unfold over the next hour would become one of the most dramatic and emotionally explosive moments in game show history, forcing Steve Harvey to make the unprecedented decision to interrupt the show entirely and address family conflict so intense and revealing that continuing with normal programming would have been impossible. Before we explore this extraordinary story about family secrets, long-buried resentments, and the moment when carefully maintained facades finally shatter under pressure, if you believe that some family conflicts need to be addressed openly rather than hidden behind polite pretense, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these powerful moments that remind us why honesty matters more than maintaining comfortable illusions. The Bradford family from Atlanta, Georgia stood on one side of the Family Feud stage, and something about their configuration immediately caught Steve's attention. Leading the family was 48-year-old Diane Bradford, a woman whose rigid posture and forced smile suggested someone expending considerable energy to maintain composure. Standing beside Diane was her husband Kenneth, their adult son Brandon, who was 25 years old, and two women who Diane introduced as her sister Carolyn and her daughter Stephanie, who was 23. The family demonstrated appropriate enthusiasm when cameras began rolling, but Steve noticed that Diane and Carolyn stood as far apart as the stage configuration allowed, that they avoided making eye contact with each other, and that there was palpable tension radiating from both women that created an uncomfortable atmosphere everyone present could feel, but nobody immediately understood. Diane and Carolyn Bradford had grown up as sisters in a middle-class family in Atlanta, and for the first 2 decades of their lives, their relationship had been relatively typical of siblings, with a 5-year age gap. Diane, being the older sister, had often been responsible for supervising Carolyn during their childhood, a dynamic that had created some resentment, but nothing extraordinary or particularly damaging. Both sisters had married, established careers, and built separate adult lives that included regular but not intensive contact with each other. On the surface, their relationship appeared functional and appropriate for adult siblings who maintained family connections without being particularly close or deeply involved in each other's daily lives. What had destroyed the sisters' relationship and created the tension now evident on the Family Feud stage had occurred 23 years earlier, when both women had been dealing with significant personal challenges. Diane had been struggling with infertility after several years of unsuccessful attempts to conceive a child with Kenneth. The emotional toll of repeated disappointments had been devastating for Diane, who had always envisioned motherhood as central to her identity and life purpose. She had undergone multiple rounds of fertility treatments, experienced the heartbreak of miscarriages, and had reached a point of profound despair about whether she would ever be able to have the child she desperately wanted. Carolyn, meanwhile, had become pregnant unexpectedly at 20 years old during a brief relationship with a man who had made clear immediately that he wanted no involvement in parenting. Carolyn had been terrified about the prospect of single motherhood, uncertain about her ability to provide for a child financially and emotionally, and deeply conflicted about what choice to make regarding the pregnancy. She had confided in Diane about her situation, seeking advice and support from her older sister during what felt like an impossible decision about whether to continue the pregnancy or to terminate it given her circumstances. During that conversation, Diane had made a proposal that had seemed at the time like a solution that would benefit everyone involved. She had suggested that Carolyn continue the pregnancy, and that upon the baby's birth, Diane and Kenneth would adopt the child and raise it as their own. Diane had presented this arrangement as giving Carolyn freedom from the responsibilities of single motherhood while also allowing Diane to finally become a mother after years of infertility struggles. She had promised that the adoption would be handled properly through legal channels, that Carolyn would have some ongoing contact with the child if she desired, and that the arrangement would be beneficial for everyone, including the baby, who would be raised in a stable two-parent household rather than by a struggling single mother. Carolyn, overwhelmed and uncertain about her options, had eventually agreed to Diane's proposal. She had continued the pregnancy, while Diane and Kenneth had prepared emotionally and practically for becoming parents through adoption. When Carolyn had given birth to a daughter, she had held the baby briefly in the hospital before transferring custody to Diane and Kenneth, who had been waiting to take their new daughter home. The legal adoption had been completed, and Diane and Kenneth had named the baby Stephanie, raising her as their biological daughter without ever telling her the truth about her origins. The initial agreement had been that Carolyn would maintain some role in Stephanie's life, perhaps as a beloved aunt who visited regularly and had a special relationship with her biological daughter, even if that relationship was not openly acknowledged. However, as months passed after the adoption, Diane had become increasingly uncomfortable with Carolyn's presence in Stephanie's life. She had begun to fear that Stephanie might somehow sense the truth about their biological connection, or that Carolyn might eventually disclose the adoption and disrupt the family dynamic that Diane had worked so hard to create. Gradually and deliberately, Diane had created distance between her family and Carolyn, reducing contact to obligatory holiday gatherings and discouraging the close relationship between Stephanie and Carolyn that had been part of their original understanding. Carolyn had been hurt and angry about Diane's withdrawal and what she perceived as a violation of their agreement about maintaining contact. However, she had felt powerless to challenge the situation given that the adoption was legal and that Diane and Kenneth had full parental rights over Stephanie. Carolyn had tried to maintain what connection she could during limited family gatherings, watching from a distance as her biological daughter grew up calling Diane Mom, and having no knowledge that the aunt she saw occasionally at holidays was actually her birth mother. The pain of this arrangement had been constant and profound for Carolyn, creating resentment toward Diane that deepened with each passing year. Stephanie had grown up as Diane and Kenneth's daughter, unaware that she had been adopted, and that the aunt she barely knew was actually her biological mother. Diane had convinced herself that never telling Stephanie the truth was in everyone's best interest, that knowledge about the adoption would only confuse and hurt Stephanie unnecessarily, and that maintaining the fiction of biological parenthood was protecting her daughter from complicated truths that served no useful purpose. Kenneth had supported Diane's decision to keep the adoption secret, though he had occasionally expressed discomfort with the deception and had suggested that Stephanie deserved to know the truth about her origins. The situation had become exponentially more complicated when Stephanie had reached adulthood and had begun asking questions about family medical history for routine health screenings. Diane had provided false information about genetic health conditions, maintaining the fiction that Stephanie shared her biological heritage, when the reality was that Stephanie's actual genetic health history came from Carolyn and the biological father who had never been involved. This deception had created potential medical risks for Stephanie, who was making health decisions based on inaccurate information about her genetic predispositions. The tension between Diane and Carolyn had reached a critical point several months before their Family Feud appearance, when Carolyn had confronted Diane privately and had demanded that Stephanie be told the truth about her adoption. Carolyn had argued that Stephanie was now an adult who deserved to know her true biological origins, that continuing the deception was unfair to everyone involved, and that the fiction was creating medical risks by depriving Stephanie of accurate genetic health information. Diane had refused absolutely, insisting that telling Stephanie would destroy their mother-daughter relationship, that Carolyn had forfeited any right to make demands when she had agreed to the adoption 23 years earlier, and that the matter was closed for discussion. That confrontation had left both sisters angry and barely speaking to each other, maintaining only the most minimal contact necessary for obligatory family functions. When Diane had decided to apply for Family Feud and had needed family members to complete the team, she had reluctantly included Carolyn because excluding her completely would have raised questions from other family members about the state of their relationship. Carolyn had agreed to participate partly because she hoped to spend time with Stephanie, even in the artificial context of a game show, and partly because she harbored some barely acknowledged hope that the experience might create an opportunity to finally tell Stephanie the truth. As Steve Harvey began the game with his characteristic energy and warmth, the Bradford family played competently despite the obvious tension between Diane and Carolyn. Steve noticed immediately that the two sisters never looked at each other, never celebrated each other's correct answers, and seemed to be participating in completely separate experiences despite standing on the same stage. During the first commercial break, Steve approached Diane and asked directly whether everything was okay with her family, noting that there seemed to be some tension between her and her sister. Diane had responded with forced brightness that everything was fine and that they were just focused on winning the game. The moment that shattered the carefully maintained facade occurred during the third round when the question appeared asking contestants to name something family members fight about but never resolve. Carolyn buzzed in first and answered with immediate and pointed intensity, stating secrets that should have been told years ago. The response registered as the number 2 answer on the board, and the audience applauded routinely. Diane, however, visibly stiffened and turned to look at Carolyn with an expression that combined shock, anger, and something very close to fear. Steve noticed the exchange and recognized immediately that Carolyn's answer had been directed specifically at Diane rather than being a general response to the question. Before Steve could respond, Carolyn made a decision that would transform everything. She looked directly at Diane and stated clearly enough for the microphones to capture that she was tired of keeping secrets that harmed everyone involved, that some truths needed to be spoken regardless of who wanted them kept hidden, and that Stephanie deserved to know that Diane was not her biological mother. The studio fell into shocked silence as everyone processed what Carolyn had just revealed. Stephanie, standing several feet away, looked confused and then horrified as she began to comprehend what her aunt was saying. Diane's face went pale and then flushed red with what appeared to be fury and panic in equal measure. Steve Harvey stood frozen for a long moment, visibly struggling to process what was unfolding on his stage and to determine how to respond to a revelation this explosive and personally devastating. Finally, he made a decision that demonstrated both his moral compass and his understanding that some moments transcend entertainment. He turned to the production team and stated clearly that they needed to stop taping immediately because what was happening required addressing as human beings rather than as game show participants. The cameras stopped rolling, and Steve asked everyone except the Bradford family to leave the stage, creating privacy for what he recognized would be an extraordinarily difficult conversation. What followed was not filmed for broadcast, but was witnessed by everyone present on the stage and in the immediate production area. Stephanie, her voice shaking with emotion, demanded that Diane explain what Carolyn meant about not being her biological mother. Diane attempted initially to dismiss Carolyn's statement as vindictive lies stemming from old family conflicts, but Carolyn interrupted and provided specific details about the pregnancy, the adoption, and the agreement that had been made 23 years earlier. Kenneth, Diane's husband, confirmed quietly that what Carolyn was saying was true, and that Stephanie had been adopted as an infant, though he had always believed that Stephanie should have been told the truth. Stephanie's reaction was a combination of shock, betrayal, and rage directed primarily at Diane, who had lied to her for her entire life. She demanded to know why Diane had never told her the truth, why she had been deprived of knowing her biological mother, and how Diane could justify maintaining such a fundamental deception for 23 years. Diane attempted to explain that she had been trying to protect Stephanie from unnecessary confusion, that she had loved and raised Stephanie as her own, and that biological connection mattered less than the relationship they had built. Stephanie rejected these explanations entirely, stating that Diane had stolen her right to know her own identity and that the betrayal of such prolonged deception had destroyed any trust between them. If this story has affected you, if it has reminded you of the damage that family secrets create and the importance of honesty even when truth is difficult, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who needs to understand that maintaining deceptions to avoid uncomfortable conversations ultimately causes more harm than speaking difficult truths. The story of the Bradford family demonstrates that secrets kept to protect people often harm them more profoundly than the truths being hidden, and that authentic relationships require honesty as their foundation, regardless of how painful that honesty might initially feel.